Let's talk now to Mr. Ambrose Igboke, public affairs analyst, who joins us virtually from Enugu. Good morning to you, and thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning, Ladi. Thanks for having me.
Let's start from what we had just been reporting, the issue of food and food supplies. There are those who have argued that in war, anything goes, and if war is declared, then you don't expect anybody to comply by the rules. So does it come to you as a surprise that much is being made of the fact that Russia is preventing Ukraine from exporting grain, and it's in its own case, it's also not allowing the normal movement of grain to countries it deems unfriendly?
Well, the part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and part of the Charter of the United Nations and the different conventions thereof have always stated that there are protocols when it involves war, especially international war. And one of those conventions stated that you must allow corridors, safe corridors for food, for medical facilities, and safe corridors for especially the civilian casualties of the war to move away, to move to safety. Those are standards in every war. Therefore, Russia is therefore going against international established war conventions that we're supposed to allow food to come into the country and also food to also go out, so that civilians who are trapped in the war zone can be taken care of. These things happened during the Second World War and First World War, but it is surprising that in this modern times, this kind of actions are still happening. And in all places that we can think of, it's happening in Europe. Europe that claims to be the light of civilization, Europe that claims to be the champions of democracy, Europe that claims to be the people that shows the other parts of the world the way to live civilization. It is a very disappointing act, and the United Nations should wrap up all efforts to ensure that Russia desists from this act going forward.
Let's come to the conflict itself, shall we, and look at some of the facts as they stand. It does appear that from all the reports, the Russians are making slow but steady progress in the Donbas region, and as the Ukrainian president has admitted this morning, the two twin cities that they had been after for quite a number of days now have in fact become dead cities. In other words, possibly the Ukrainians are about to lose those cities to the Russians. That will open a corridor. Now, does this give you the impression that ultimately, even though there will have to be negotiations, the military facts on the ground are not going in support of Ukraine?
That is very evident. Ukraine itself knows that it cannot stand against Russia. If we can trace this historically, we remember that as part of the bargain that followed the USSR in the 90s, Ukraine was asked to surrender its nuclear weapons, which was destroyed, and part of it was also taken by Russia, was relocated to Russia. That seems to me that Russia has planned this for a very long time, because you know that you have removed the nuclear capabilities and nuclear arsenal of Ukraine. Therefore, you have left them open. So the next thing, Russia has the nuclear capabilities and has all the war equipment. Therefore, it was easy for them to just roll into Ukraine. Russia did it in Crimea. They succeeded. Remember Ossetia, Georgia, they invaded it. So Russia is being emboldened because when they did it, nothing happened. And also, they may be taking the cue from what happened when, for example, when the Americans invaded Iraq and some other countries. So they are becoming emboldened. And from all indication on ground, it is very clear that militarily they outclass Ukraine. And they are bent on taking those eastern region because they are Russians speaking. And Russia believes that since they are Russian speaking, that they are part of the Russian nation. And they don't ought to be in Ukraine. So that is the strategy. And it has been deliberate. And from what I'm seeing, I am saying that the Russians might take those regions, just as they took Crimea.
Given that the situation shouldn't be that uneven, those who are listening to you would say, because Ukraine has received massive military support, everything short of boots on the ground from the West, the UK, the US. Even just this week, the United Kingdom joined the United States in promising that they would send longer range weapons to the Ukrainians. Is it that you don't think that is making as much of a difference as it should make?
Well, I don't think so. Why? I will explain. Most of the weaponry that's been sent to Ukraine are actually defensive systems. They are not attacking systems. So it just means that Ukraine will sit, Russia will launch the long-range missiles into Ukraine, and then for it to contain those attacks of Russia and to minimize damages, these defense equipments are being sent, like what we call the multiple launch rocket systems are being sent. The M270 that is will be sent to Ukraine by UK. I mean, UK has pledged 1.3 billion pounds of military assistance. But Russia has also warned that once the US or UK or any other country sends attacking systems to Ukraine, that it will take the war a notch higher. And therefore, I don't think the UK or US will want to risk sending attack systems to Ukraine. And that is where the problem is. Because if you give defense systems to Ukraine and you don't give them attacking system, therefore Russia is still free to attacking them. What the defense system does is to minimize damage or, do some kind of control in the damage it will cause in Ukraine. So that is why I'm saying that it is still not enough.
Let's look at the other side of this, which is attempts at peace. A lot of destruction has gone on. Significant loss of lives have happened, and both military and others on both sides. And Ukraine is in real, almost a rubble, so to speak. And as you talked about, because of the fact that many of the weapons they have are defensive, so that brings us the issue of peace talks. Do you see anything at all on the horizon that would encourage either party or both parties to now take a look at peace talks?
My prediction is that Russia will not back down until it takes those eastern regions in Donbass region. Those Russian-speaking sites, when it takes it and has total control and feels that it can annex it to Russia, just like what they did in Crimea, then they can now sit down on the table. History has also shown us that in every war, there must be, after you won war, you have to judge up. Therefore, all wars end in a negotiating table. But I believe this one will also end in a negotiating table. Because as it is for now, I don't see any negotiating table coming up. Russia is playing some kind of deliberate schemes to ensure that it captures that region that is Russian-speaking, annex it to Russia, and then can now say we are ready to talk. And that is when I think Russia will be ready to talk with anybody about this issue.
Well, before we end this conversation, I must then ask you about the outside forces. We've been discussing Russia and Ukraine, but you and I both know that this situation is not wholly Russia versus Ukraine. There are other parties that are involved. In the case of the support for Ukraine, you have Western countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and the others. In the case of Russia, you've got other countries that are indirectly, without publicizing their support, also giving some helping hand, either in the purchase of oil or in other forms of support, the likes of India, the likes of China, and so on. These outside forces, could they play a role in bringing the two major parties to the table?
Well, I will say boldly that the war in the first place was actually caused by these outside forces. So you are right that they can bring it together. We remember that the Cold War did not end. The Cold War of the 60s and the 70s did not actually end. It just simmered down. So the West Bloc and the East Bloc is still there, fighting shadow wars. And Ukraine, unluckily, has to be a pawn in the chess game of war that is currently going on. What is causing it? What has caused it that Ukraine's move to join NATO. And Russia has said that, no, you cannot join NATO because this was a treaty we signed that you will not come out, NATO will not be around Russian borders. And Russia feels that that treaty has been, jettisoned. And therefore, they said if any attempt to do that, then Ukraine wanted to join NATO. And that is the genesis of this invasion by Russia. Therefore, when the rhetoric from the West tones down, and when the rhetoric from the East tones down, then these outside forces can now come together and say, okay, let's stop this war. The war is actually a function of outside forces, not a function of Ukraine. Ukraine is just a pawn in the chess game of these global interests.
Unfortunately, a grim reality there. But thank you very much, Mr. Ambrose Igboke, for your views this morning. Thank you for your time on the program.
Thank you, Vladi, for having me this morning.